And we have a recording in progress. Now I'm going to see if I can share a screen. And lo and behold, there is a screen to share. So let's go to the beginning. And as I said, we're moving from the Orient to actually Moldova. So that's in the middle somewhere, or Moravia, actually. You've got Slovenia, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Germany, somewhere out there in Moravia. Okay, so let's have a look. As I said, the title of what we'll be doing for probably more than a couple of weeks is the Chacham Tzvi, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Ashkenazi, 1656 to 1718, second day of Yom Tov, heartless chickens and artificial intelligence. So let's begin. A lot of people can read tonight in English, so there we are. Michael, would you like to have a crack, please? Michael Rosenfeld.
Chacham Tzvi was born in 1656 in Trebitz, Moravia, to his father, Rav Yaakov Tzadok Dayan in Vilna.
No, Rabbi Yaakov Zak.
Zak.
Zak. Now, Zak is Zayin Kuf, and it stands for Zera Kodesh. Jews did not really have surnames. They didn't have family names. Family names were either adopted because they were miyuchasim, like Kohanim could be Azulai or Kajdan. Leviim would be Segal, Sgan Leviyah. And Zak is Zera Kodesh, which could either mean a lot of yichus or descent from the Chasidei Ashkenaz, those who had sacrificed their lives, not become Christians during the period of the Crusades. So that's where the Zak comes from. He was okay, Michael, can you please read on?
Dayan in Vilna, who fled the city in the wake of the Chmelnytsky massacres and found refuge with his family in Trebitz. His mother...
In other words, what we're talking about in the 1640s, 300,000 Jews. There's a large number were affected by the massacres, the Cossacks under Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who is currently somewhat of a Ukrainian nationalist hero, but he certainly produced one of the worst pogroms, okay? Yeah. And so the Vilna family had to flee, and Rabbi Zak's family, in fact, fled. But he actually was left behind, and he had a bit of a tough time. There's a legend that he was actually spared from death by a Cossack for some reason that he didn't understand, but he managed to rejoin his family in Moravia in Trebitz. Sorry? Okay, not me. Fine. So let us continue. Rabbi Yaakov Zak was well known as a Baki Gadol, an expert in all areas of Jewish law, and one of his students was the famous Rabbi David Oppenheimer of Prague, who wrote that he knew by heart all the four orders of the Shulchan Aruch. But of course, it didn't help him when it came to the Khmelnytsky massacres. He was actually taken captive because when he fled, he fell into the hands of some Germans who decided they were going to take him captive and hold him for ransom. He ended up in Berlin. That was, and well, that in fact was after Trebitz. So let's stay in Moravia. So the Zaks arrive in Moravia, and let's read a little more about Chacham Tzvi. Okay, his mother
was the daughter of Rav Ephraim Cohen, author of Responsa Shar Ephraim, and the descendant of Rav Eliyahu Baal Shem Tov of Chelm.
So we're going to talk about here when we talk about golems and artificial intelligence, but this is a very miyuchas family. The Baal Shem was somebody who had mystical knowledge and could cure people. Medicine in those days was very eclectic. And this is the line, in fact, that goes from Rabbi Elijah Baal Shem Tov of Chelm to Rabbi Ephraim Cohen and to Trebitz. Yonat, would you like to read, please? Thank you, Michael. The family moved.
The family then moved to Althofen, Abuda, present-day Budapest.
In other words, you have Buddha, you have Pest, and you have Old Buddha, which in German was Althofen. Okay? So eventually they were all combined into one city, but they were in fact three different cities. Where Rabbi
Cohen was rabbi and Rosh Yeshiva. Young Tzvi Hirsch studied with both his father and his grandfather in the later yeshiva.
That's his yeshiva, the yeshiva belonging to his grandfather. Right.
During that period, the city was under Ottoman rule, and Rabbi Cohen was in regular contact with leading Sephardic authorities such as Rabbi Moshe Hagitz and Rabbi Moses Galante.
And we know, of course, all about them. And if you don't, then you'll find out as we move through the coming shiurim. But just to remind you, the Ottomans came into prominence in 1517, and they moved north. And they, in fact, arrived at the gates of Vienna. And it was in 1683, in fact, that they were stopped there. But they had already eaten up the Balkans and certainly Hungary too. And it wasn't until the Habsburgs engaged in a counterattack that eventually in Karlowitz in 1699, there was a treaty in which the Ottomans had to retreat from Hungary. But Hungary, the Balkans, Moravia, Slovenia, they were all under Ottoman rule. So not surprising that there's a lot of contact with the Sephardic world. And we'll see that in different contexts, in halakhic contexts later on in the 18th and in the 18th century, especially in Bohemia, in Prague. So just to establish the Sephardic connection, because this explains the next bit. In 1673, one more line, please.
1673, Tzvi Hirsch traveled to Salonika, where he attended the yeshiva of the Chacham Rabbi Eliyahu Kovo, the Av Beit Din, Rosh Yeshiva, and author of respective
Responsa. Okay, now it's interesting because, as you know, Sephardic authorities generally give a young man the title of Chacham and not Rav, okay?
Yeah.
There is an Israeli kind of joke that here in Israel in the early days, there was a bus going from Jerusalem to Ramleh, and the bus was quite full. Only one seat was free. That was next to a woman. So the last passenger to get on is an Ashkenazi, Rov, and he looks at the woman in the seat and he says, I'm going to stand. But after him, a Sephardi, Chacham, arrives. He rushes up, the last person on the bus as the door is about to be closed. He sits next to the woman. He says, good afternoon. He sits down and he's very pleasant. At the end of the ride, when they get to Ramleh, the driver turns to the Sephardic Chacham as he's getting down and says, how come that the Ashkenazi Rav did not sit next to a woman, but you did? So the Sephardic Chacham says, yes, well, that's because he's a Rav, but I'm a Chacham. So, as I said, it is meant to be kind of humorous. There may be something in that, and it does come out actually in Chacham Tzvi. Chacham Tzvi, was he an Ashkenazi or a Sephardi? From what we've just said. Hello?
Yeah.
Was it
100% Ashkenazi.
Aha, you couldn't be more Ashkenazi than Chacham Tzvi. Come on, okay?
Yeah.
His whole line. On his mother's side, Rabbi Ephraim Cohen from Vilna. His father's side, Dayan in Vilna. Okay, they're all Ashkenazim Muvhakim. So how come he's called Chacham Tzvi? And we know he's called Chacham Tzvi. So question is why?
His head Torah was probably sent to a Chacham.
No, not quite, almost there, but he clearly wanted to be a Chacham.
Mhm.
And we're talking about a very unique character here. So I'm preparing the ground. He went from having learned in Trebitz, he went to the yeshiva in Salonika. Now, this is definitely very Sephardic, okay?
Yeah.
And it was during this period. So let's have a line, please, from you, Shmuley. Line 15.
It was during this period that he developed his strong affinity for the Sephardic methods of Gemara study and halachic decision-making.
Thank you for the emendation. He also
Spent time in Istanbul, and it was there that he was given the title Chacham, which he used throughout his life.
So he, in fact, did get, if you like, Haskama. He got Chacham title, which was given also to Shabtai Tzvi, by the way. The other Tzvi we're going to be talking about. But he could easily have got Smichat Rav. He chose, okay, and it was there. Okay, Shmuley, another line, please.
He experienced the devastating results of the spread of the Sabbatean movement on the Jewish communities of the Ottoman Empire, and as a result, developed the fierce opposition to that and to similar antinomian mystical movements.
Antinomian simply means against the rules, okay? When you disobey the rules, antinomian. Nomos, okay. Mystical movements based upon a mystical theory, which
accompanied him for the rest of his life, sometimes to his great cost.
His son,
Rav Yaakov Emden, inherited this opposition from his father and is famous for his dogged pursuit of Sabbatean heresies, especially in the course of the Emden-Eibishitz amulet controversy.
Eibishitz.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to talk about that too. But this was a great shock for the entire Jewish world. Now, because Shabtai Tzvi and that movement is such a powerful background factor in Jewish life in the 17th and even in the early 18th centuries, and even has some after effects today, I'm going to tell the story of Shabtai Tzvi, the other Tzvi, okay? So I'll tell you briefly. I'm also going to put, a voice on my left says, put your feet up. She might want to say, if you're sitting comfortably, then I will begin. And Shabtai Tzvi was born on a Shabbat, hence his name Shabtai. He was born in Izmir in Turkey in 1626 to a very wealthy merchant. And he studied like a regular young Jewish boy under Rabbi Joseph Eskafa, who's a rabbi of Izmir, and the author of something that we learn on the tour. I mean, one of the major commentaries on the tour is the Rosh Yosef. That's Yosef Eskafa of Izmir. He received the title of Chacham from his teacher, Rabbi Eskafa, but in his 20s, he started to behave very strangely. He would go into isolation. He formed a secret group of disciples for the study of the Zohar and of Kabbalah. He also was married twice and divorced twice because he couldn't consummate the marriages. There's a lot of stuff about the sexual aspect of Shabtai Tzvi, and I won't go into that for the time being. Something very odd there, okay? He also started to develop a theory that in order to save the world, you may have to commit sins. In other words, this is the mystical idea of redeeming the sparks from the klipot, from the husks. There are a lot of things that are not so marvelous in this world. You need to go into them and improve them by becoming part of them. And hence we have the idea of Aveira Lishma. You commit a sin for the sake of redeeming the evil, being part of that evil, and then overcoming it. So this is the whole issue, it's the Kabbalistic idea that God's light was scattered in the Shvirat HaKelim. We talked about this in the Zohar quite a bit. When the receptacles were smashed, the light disappeared and has to be regathered from wherever it is. And there's nothing in the world which doesn't have some kind of divine spark, but you have to go there and get it out. And that may mean that you need to sing. And he also, for example, was famous for saying that the true meaning of the bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam, matir asurim, he read as matir isurim. You are allowed to commit sin.
That's very good.
That's very good. I thought you might like that. So we commit sins in order to reach a higher purpose. They may be sexual deviationist sins. They may be sins involving not fasting on the fast of the Churban. They may be sins involving pronouncing God's name according to the letters that we never do, because in the times of the Mashiach, as the Gemara in Pesachim tells us, we will be able to read God's name as it is written. Well, Shabtai became more deeply engaged in all of this sort of weird stuff. In fact, he almost drowned, actually, because he used to go to dip in the sea. Not much of a mikveh there. And he was almost drowned, carried away, and his followers marked that day with a festival that he wasn't drowned. Eventually, he took all his followers to the top of a hill and said, I'm going to stop the sun, just like Yoshua bin Nun. Well, the rabbis of Izmir finally lost patience, and they drove him out of the city in 1654. Well, then he went to Salonika. He did all sorts of weird things there. So the rabbis of Salonika said, get out of town. But he was gathering disciples all the time. In 1658, he gets to Constantinople, and he does an interesting chag. He reads the Haggadah, has a Seder in the Sukkah, and drinks milk products and marks the giving of the Torah on the same day. Okay? The rabbis of Constantinople hear about this, and they drive him out of the city as well. Gershom Sholem, the famous professor of Kabbalah, thinks that he was suffering from he was bipolar. But he continues doing these things, and at other times he seems fairly normal. But it's difficult to explain. He keeps on getting thrown out of Jewish towns, comes back to Izmir, and he's depressed. So his brothers send him to Eretz Israel. They say, look, you clearly have a bad case of Jerusalem syndrome. Go to Jerusalem, okay, where you'll meet other people like you. They're also embarrassed. They wanted to get rid of him. And he went there via Egypt. But there he was able to win over a very rich Jew called Raphael Yosef, who was the leader, the Parnas, the lay leader of Egyptian Jewry, very wealthy. And he, for some reason, was taken in or believed in Shabtai Tzvi, and Shabtai Tzvi began to spread to a few people the message that he was the Mashiach. He was the Mashiach. And it was in Egypt that he heard about a woman called Sarah, who was spreading news right to the Jewish world that she was the Mashiach's wife. Now, she was somewhat of a loose woman, but Shabtai Tzvi was thrilled, and he paid for her ticket to come to Egypt. And they married, and she was called the Malka. And how did he explain her notorious background? Well, like the prophet Hosea, God commanded him to marry a prostitute. You may remember the book of Hosea, okay? And this is part of his elevated spirituality by taking the sparks out of even the most hard and dissolute woman. Marry her. That woman, Davka. So we now find that with Raphael Yosef's blessing, he now goes to Jerusalem. is a bit calm for a while. But, and in fact, he's so impressed with the Jewish rabbis, they say, you have to go back to Egypt. You know, Raphael Yosef, you can get money for us. The old Yeshub was always sending shadarim, messengers out to Chutz Aretz to collect money to support the yeshivot, the kolelim. Nothing has changed. And so he comes back to Egypt. He raises a lot of money. And on his way back to Jerusalem, he goes via Gaza to meet somebody called Nathan Ashkenazi, another Ashkenazi, Jerusalem-born, Talmid Chacham, studied under Rabbi Moshe Chagiz, but Jerusalem was a bit heavy. He goes to Gaza, and he sets himself up as a prophet. Again, he teaches Uriani Kabbalah, emphasizes the need to redeem the uncleanliness and the defilement, the sparks from the husks. And he starts inviting people to come to him for tshuva and for everything connected with doing penitence and becoming a better person. So he becomes a guru for those who are seeking spiritual calm and contentment by all sorts of mystical practices. So Shabtai Tzvi goes to Gaza to meet Nathan of Gaza. And that really is how it all begins. Because Nathan writes a letter, right all over, and he was a very literary man, wrote these amazing letters all over. And one of the lines in his Igrot Natan Ha'azati, Ko Amar Hashem, thus says the Lord, Hinei Moshiachem ba. Your Messiah has come, Shabtai Tzvi, Shemo, his name is Shabtai Tzvi, Al Oivav Yitgaber, he will overcome all the enemies of the Jewish people. So this is the meeting that really gives the spark. Shabtai Tzvi was something charismatic, but he was also, by the way, he also had fits. And when he had fits, his face turned absolutely yellow and it shone. So it could be seen as some kind of special charisma, spiritual gift. Natan Ha'azati was highly intelligent, highly literate, and highly literary, and he believed in Shabtai Tzvi, and the pair were able to convince most of the people most of the time. It's quite remarkable. But after coming back from Gaza, Shabtai Tzvi returns to Jerusalem. And, well, we'll talk about that shortly. But I'm going to translate for you one of the letters that Natan Ha'azati was sending all over the Jewish world. So he starts as follows. He says, my brothers, the house of Israel, you should know that our Mashiach was born in Izmir, and his name is Shabtai Tzvi. And very soon, his kingship will be revealed, and he will take the crown from the head of the Ishmaelite king, who happened to be the Sultan Mehmet IV, and will put it on his own head. And the king will follow him like a slave, because the true king is the Messiah. If you didn't know, Adonenu Malkeinu HaMashiach. May sound familiar. And after that, our Messiah will disappear for a while. We won't know whether he's dead or alive. Where will he go? He'll cross the Sambation River. Remember that famous river that during the week throws up rocks, and on Shabbat, nobody crosses it because no Jew is allowed to cross a river on Shabbat. And if he is, tries to, they stone him. And who is on the other side of the Sambation River?
10 tribes of Israel.
10 tribes of Israel. Thank you, Jack. Exactly, the lost tribes. And they are a huge army. So this is how the Mashiach is going to get the military force needed to overthrow the Ottoman Empire. And Moshe Rabbeinu is also going to be there, because he's also living with the 10 tribes on the other side of the And Shabtai Tzvi is going to marry Moshe's daughter, whose name is Rivka. There you are. You never knew Moshe Rabbeinu had a daughter. Apparently she did, and her name is Rivka. And she's going to marry the Mashiach. And Moshe Rabbeinu will return together with the Bnei Rachav and the Bnei Moshe and the 10 lost tribes. They'll cross the river because miraculously it will allow them to cross during the week. And then, of course, it will return to its normal rock-throwing activity. And all of this, says Nathan of Gaza, is written in our sources. And it is more or less there. We talked about the fact when we read the Rabbaz even, that when Mashiach comes, the 10 lost tribes will come, they may have a musmach, the tribe of Reuven will return, they may have a musmach. Rabbaz said that the Falashas, who claim to be descendants of Dan, are authentic Jews and don't need to undergo conversion. Jews lived their tradition and very little else. So all of this was quite exciting. And then he talks about the appearance from heaven of a lion, and then there'll be a snake or a serpent with 7 heads, and etc., etc. And then fire and brimstone all over, and Mashiach will, accompanied by Moshe Rabbeinu and all of the 10 tribes, vast armies will come to Jerusalem, and they'll meet Gog and Magog on the way, and they will defeat them. How? Not by spear and sword, but just by the spirit of Shabtai Tzvi, the Mashiach, and they will all fall to the ground. And then they will come to Jerusalem. God will drop down the temple from heaven. It'll be wonderful. Gold, silver, shining, precious stones. The whole of Jerusalem will be brilliant, bathed in this supernal light. And then Mashiach will offer sacrifices. And then there'll be Tchiat HaMeitim for everybody in the entire world. And wow, what a wonderful thing. And this is the message that Natan, who changed his name according to Shabtai Tzvi's instructions, Nathan of Gaza, is writing to communities all over the Jewish world. Now, they hadn't experienced anything like this quite before. We did mention David HaRuveni, who did get some support, but this wasn't. The PR job that Nathan of Gaza did was worthy of the most entrepreneurial New York PR firm. Nobody could have done a better job. And they were uniform. They
the
were
people in Hamas are doing a good job today of
There were souvenirs. They wore blue. They were bits of material you could affix to your garment. This became a huge machine. Okay. Now, so Shabtai Tzvi goes back to Jerusalem. Nathan of Gaza uses Gaza as his base and works on promoting Shabtai Tzvi. And there's a cute line because when he came back, they said, okay, Shabtai, we've had these funny letters. We don't believe them. But where's the money you were meant to have raised? Well, the money was there, but not as much as he was meant to have brought back. So they weren't very happy in the kollels and the yeshivas. And then they said, Shabtai Tzvi, Yatsa Shaliach, v'chazar Mashiach. Okay, in other words, what's going on here? Yatsa Shaliach, v'chazar Mashiach. So they said, leave. Rabbi Moshe Chagiz got very angry, and Shabtai Tzvi goes back to Izmir, but he goes via Syria. Damascus and Aleppo gathers more supporters. And many Jews start to believe. Now, why would they believe? Well, a number of things. First of all, there was this brand new Kabbalah that the Ari HaKadosh promulgated and his student, okay, the Gurei Ha'ari began, Rabbi Chaim Vital began to spread. Then there was the feeling that we are in the period before the Mashiach, Chevlei Mashiach, suffering. Sephardim underwent the expulsion from Spain. Ashkenazim, the Khmelnytsky massacres, as I said, 300,000 Jews killed, massacred, sold into slavery, whole communities wiped out. They eventually, some of them came back, but they were cataclysmic events. And then you're looking for a reason. Why are these terrible things happening to us? And Mashiach is the answer. It's Chevlei Mashiach, the birth pangs of the Messiah. And this is what Natan Ha'azati worked on hard, and Shabtai Tzvi eventually got the plot. And in 1665, Shabtai Tzvi comes back to Izmir for the third time, and this time he wins. He has a huge following. He occupies a Portuguese Esnocha by force, and he summons the rabbis, one of whom was Reb Chaim Palachi, the Bal Knesset Hagdolah, a tremendous Talmid Chacham whose commentary on the Shulchan Aruch we use to this day, Sephardi, who was opposed to him, but his opposition was overcome. And when he realized that the people were on the streets, there was tumult, there was joy, people were going crazy over Shabtai Tzvi, he had no option but, in order to save his life even, his colleague, Rabbi Yaakov Lapape, left. He was driven out of the city because he objected. So what did Shabtai Tzvi do in the Portuguese synagogue in Izmir? He took out the Torah, read the Torah with the name of God as it is written. He called up 14 Olim and Olot, 7 supporters, his family and his major Talmidim, called them all kings, and 7 women. Because women and men, Kabbalah, we have to have the Nekeva and the Zachar and the Nekeva. He allowed people to ignore Isur Yichud, okay, Matir Isurim, and he also abolished all the Churban fasts, and eventually all his followers would eat and drink on Tisha B'Av, which he called Chag HaNechamot.
Because that was his birthday.
Really?
Apparently he was born on Tisha B'Av.
I know he was born on a Shabbat, but it would suit a
He
Mashiach.
said he was born on Tisha B'Av.
It would be very good for a candidate
to be born on
Mashiach.
Tisha B'Av, okay?
But he wasn't.
Exactly. So,
Okay.
but I'm not sure he was. However, it doesn't matter. He organized marches all over the city. Now, to give you some feeling for what was happening, not only in Izmir, but all over especially the Sephardi world, but also in the Ashkenazi world. Anybody heard of Glickel of Hamlin?
Oui, yes.
Glickel of Hamlin.
Mhm.
Can anybody tell me, perhaps the voice on my left will give us a little bit of information about Glickel of Hamlin?
That's the
It's a woman who, the first woman, Jewish woman who wrote, comment on dit?
A diary.
A diary of her life, and she says, and I read it once, and she tells that in Frankfurt or in which town people were selling their houses in order to go to Israel.
Because of Shabtai Tzvi was the Mashiach, exactly. Okay, she was a very talented businesswoman, and we learn a lot about Jewish life in the 17th century from Glickel, very competent woman. I'm going to now read an extract from her diary describing the Sabbatean craze at the time. And this is what Glickel writes: the joy whenever the letters that Natan Ha'azati wrote, that was in the community when these letters were received, they were read out, especially by the Sephardim, okay? And they would be read out in the Esnocha, in the shuls, in the synagogues. Then Ashkenazim, young and old, used to go there to the Batei Knesiot HaPortugesi. And the Bachurim HaPortugesim ayu tamid mitlabshim bebigdei chag v'amdu aleihem pasei tchelet meshi. They would be dressed up in their Shabbat and Chag finery with a blue stripe, a silk blue stripe, which indicated they were followers of Shabtai Tzvi. They are semel uvusho shel Shabtai Tzvi v'kol yatzu kulam betupim ubimcholot. They went out in the streets playing musical instruments, dancing from one synagogue to another, just like says Glickel Simchat Bet HaShoeva. And they would read these letters aloud. And as you said, Jean, some sold their homes and all of their possessions, because the day of redemption was coming. They would all be taken miraculously to Eretz Israel. My father-in-law, who lived in Hamel at the time, okay, right, Hamel, which is Hamlin, that's Glickel, he left his home and just went to live in Hildesheim, because that was where they were gathering a large group of Shabtai Tzvi supporters ready to go to the land of Israel. And what he did, and here she's very practical. She says, look, I mean, what did my father-in-law do? He packed a lot of good stuff into big barrels and left it with us. These barrels included all sorts of fine materials, textiles, and foodstuffs. And she describes dried meat, legumes, dried fruit, etc., things that could be preserved. And because this good man, Chashav ki tekef nasa me Hamburg le'eretz HaKadosha. They would go to Hamburg, and from there, like some magic carpet, would take them to the Holy Land. And these barrels, okay, they were with us until a year was up, and then my father-in-law wrote to us and said, open up the barrels, use the stuff because it'll go bad. And they also go bad and they'll ruin the textiles. And for 3 years, we lived off those barrels, but he never went on the journey because it never happened. Now and this was happening all over. So when I wrote that Chacham Tzvi saw the devastation in the wake of Shabtai Tzvi, that's what I'm talking about. Whole communities basically bankrupted themselves. They descended into poverty because they believed in the Mashiach. Okay? Now, there were some opponents. Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas from Morocco, Amsterdam, London, Hamburg, and Livorno. They bitterly criticized the whole movement, and also they bitterly criticized their rabbis who didn't have the courage to stand up and say this is a lie. Well, eventually Shabtai Tzvi was arrested, okay? The Turkish Navy picked him up in the harbor of Constantinople. They sent him to Gallipoli. Why? Because he was, news had reached the Sultan, and he was fomenting revolt, and he was saying that he was going to overthrow the Sultan and take his crown. Well, that's not the sort of thing that an Ottoman emperor wants to hear, and he doesn't want people running around his empire spreading this message. Also, by the way, he was also credulous. I mean, people were not rational those days. So he wondered if this man did have some special powers, So he wanted to, A, neutralize him, but B, to get hold of him. And he wasn't going to treat him too harshly because perhaps he does have supernatural powers. So he sent him to a place in Gallipoli for observation. But he told the observers to go easy. Chacham Tzvi set up court. He offered up a Korban Pesach. He ate on the fast. He received many visitors, including East Europeans. The children of the Taz, in fact, Rabbi David Alevi went to see Shabtai Tzvi in Gallipoli, and he's explained that before you can get to become the full-blown Mashiach, you have to suffer. Mashiach has to go through this period of poverty and suffering, and this is what is happening to him now, but he's going to arise and overthrow the Sultan. What happened? Eventually, a Polish Kabbalist called Nehemiah Cohen went to visit Shabtai Tzvi, and he spoke to him for 3 days. Now, at the end of this period, he got a message of the Sultan saying that Shabtai Tzvi is a fake. He has no powers at all. He's a dangerous man. Get rid of him. Why did Nehemiah Cohen do this? Some say he was planted by the Sultan. Apparently, he claimed to be Mashiach ben Yosef. Mashiach ben Yosef has to come first. And Mashiach ben David has already come. That's not good because Mashiach ben Yosef has to pave the way for Mashiach ben David. And therefore, he was jealous. So he wanted to take him down. And finally, it could be that he was sent by the opponents of Shabtai Tzvi clandestinely to expose him. So Mehmet lost his patience entirely, and he sent Shabtai Tzvi to him when he was in Adrianople and said, look, Shabtai Tzvi, you have a choice. I'm either going to chop off your head right now, or you'll become a Muslim. What did Shabtai Tzvi do?
Become a Muslim.
He became a Muslim. He was called Aziz Muhammad. He received a nice pension from the Sultan. He is now a Muslim. The Jewish world was in shock. Mainstream communities didn't know what to do. So the reaction set in. They removed Shabtai Tzvi's name from every document. They destroyed evidence of their own Sabbateanism. Council of the Four Lands said from now on, nobody studies Kabbalah except people who we approve of. And eventually, of course, the whole thing died down. But the cost was tremendous. And by the way, Nathan of Gaza didn't stop. He said, look, natural, Shabtai Tzvi has to become a Muslim because the Muslims also have some of the lights. And he has to go down there to take those lights out. So it's natural that he became a Muslim. And he and Shabtai Tzvi would go around the Jewish communities to those who still believed, and people still believed. They would do a combination of Islam and Judaism, and they encouraged people. And eventually the Sultan, of course, lost patience, and he exiled Shabtai Tzvi to a fortress in Albania, died at the age of 50 in 1676. What did Nathan of Gaza say? He didn't die. Hit'alem ba'orot ha'elyonim. He's gone up to the higher lights, and he will soon return. It's funny how some of these things actually continue in one form or the other to this day. Anyhow, a sect emerged called, the sect of Sabbateans that still exists to this day?
The Bolsheviks.
No, Shmuley, not those.
Rabbi Soz?
The Donme.
No.
The Donme. Okay? And by the way, Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, Erdogan, oh, yeah, well, whatever, Tayyip or
More.
Tayyip, Erdogan, okay, Erdogan, you say Erdogan, I read it Erdogan, okay.
He's a bit of a dog.
By the way, he says that Ataturk, you remember Kemal Ataturk, who founded modern Turkey? Apparently, he was a child of Donme people. So what Erdogan does is he blames the modernist fashion in Turkey on the Jews, on the combination of Jews. The Jews will always lose out. They're responsible for all the evils in the world. As the famous witticism says, the Jews sunk the Titanic. What do you mean the Jews sunk the Titanic? Well, Greenberg, Goldberg, Iceberg, it's all the same. They're all Jews. So there we are. But that's just the end of that one. The end of that story. So it's important to have that in mind whenever we're reading about what happens, especially when we talk about Shabtai Tzvi, Yaakov Emden, and Rabbi Yonatan Eibeshitz. So let's get back to our script. And we are now
20.
line 22. Marcel, would you like, with your new glasses, please, to read?
We're 24, where are we?
23.
Shortly after his return to Alt Ophel, Hacham Tzvi married into a prominent and wealthy local family. in 1686, half of him was invaded by the Austrian army.
Because the Ottomans were still in charge, and the Habsburgs, Ottomans, and the Austrians were pushing back to get rid of the Muslims. By the way, the Muslims have come back, but they came back in a different way. But there was a long campaign between the Habsburg Austrians and others against the Ottomans, and they pushed them out of Central Europe eventually. But a cannon shot
Killed his young wife and daughter. He fled.
He fled.
He fled, becoming separated from his parents, who were taken captive by the Prussian army.
Rabbi Zach, okay, Yaakov Zach and his mother, they were all taken captive. And the Prussians said, fine, we'll take them back to Prussia and we'll ransom them. Jews are always good for generating money. So we'll make the Jewish community in Berlin pay for them. Chacham Tzvi
ended up in Bosnia, where he was appointed rabbi of a Sephardic community in Sarajevo, and he remained there until 1689.
Okay, so he gets to, sorry, he's a Chacham. So he can be a rabbi in both a Sephardi and an Ashkenazi community, okay? So he went to Bosnia, but he was forced to resign. Read on.
To resign in the wake of a decision he gave in a monetary dispute against an influential member of the community.
Chacham Tzvi is always hitting this problem. In those days, the Gevirim ruled with a rod of iron, and if you upset them, they took revenge. And Chacham Tzvi was a man of high principle, and he would not kowtow to the rich. And so he was often forced to resign. That's what happened here in his sort of first rabbinic position in Sarajevo. He had to leave, okay? Upon hearing
that his parents had been redeemed by the Berlin Jewish community, he left the Balkans via Italy, where he had traveled extensively, and arrived in Germany, where he was reunited with his parents.
Okay, so don't think that these rabbis whose books we read or hear about in Shurim were leading like nice, quiet lives, and they had years and years to sit in a study and nothing happened. It's a tough life, a very tough life. Let's see, David Parks, would you like to give us another antipodial reading?
In Berlin, he married Sarah, the daughter of Rav Meshulam Zalman Mirel's Neumark, chief rabbi of the three communities, Altona, Hamburg, and Wandsbek.
Now, this is not a Kleinigkeit, as they say in French. These are very important communities, and they were partly under Danish rule, German rule, so they're called Ahu, three communities together, a very important rabbinical position at the time. So Chacham Tzvi, young, well, not as young as he was, is now married to the daughter of the chief rabbi of these three communities, which is a plum rabbinical position. So at his father-in-law's instigation, everything's in the family.
He moved to Altona, where a number of wealthy and influential Jewish merchants founded a Kreutz and appointed him as its head.
Okay, so what is a Klois? What is a Klois?
A rabbinical court?
No, the Klois is.
Court, no, it's definitely not a court. The word, of course, is the Latin cloister. It's where this was the first type of advanced kollel. In other words, what happened was that from the 16th century in Ashkenaz, wealthy members of the community would invest in a small group, an elitist group of married scholars, usually who were the top of their field, and they would allow them to sit and study. By the way, they had to study very hard. Some of them were only allowed 3 hours sleep a night. They were allowed to go home on Shabbat, of course, so there's nothing on Shabbat in the Klois. But these became the elite learning machines of East European Jewry. There was a very rich man in Altona who did, in fact, support the Klois. And they were opening them up. I'm not going to give you the list of cities, but probably the other most famous Klois was in Brody, in Poland, in Galicia. It produced the leading halachic authorities of the age. everybody, the Nodav Yehuda went through the Klois in Brody before he became the famous Nodav Yehuda, chief rabbi of Bohemia and rabbi of Prague. They also spent time studying Kabbalah, but only them. After Shabtai Tzvi, nobody wanted to have regular Jews having anything to do with Kabbalah, so they rationed it. Only in the Klois, they also Jewish philosophy, which could have been dangerous too. You have to keep the common people, the regular Jews, learning, saying Tehillim, learning a bit of Chumash and Rashi, perhaps a little Gemara, but nothing else. As Shabtai Tzvi had quite an influence here, and the Maharal was a major pioneer of the Klois, and of course there was one in Prague. Usually there were no more than 20 members, and you spent 6 to 8 years there. And after that, most of the senior rabbinical positions in Eastern Europe went to members of a Klois. So Chacham Tzvi must have been very good to have been appointed the head of the Klois. Okay, so the fame of the Klois, another line perhaps.
The fame of the Klois spread thanks to the great erudition and intellectual acumen of its head, eventually attracting members from all over Europe and the Balkans.
So the rising Talmidei Chachamim wanted to be accepted into a Klois, and you had to be accepted. Okay, so it became, if you like, the Harvard and Yale, Oxford and Cambridge of the rabbinic world. Let's see, Jack, would you like to please read 37? Chacham Tzvi's income.
Chacham Tzvi's income from the Klois was modest, to say the least. So he was compelled to defray his living expenses by engaging in various business pursuits, including a stint as a dealer in precious stones. After the death of his father-in-law, for whom Chacham Tzvi had acted as an assistant, as the latter had grown older and frailer, one faction in the Jewish community was in favor of having him installed as chief rabbi of the 3 congregations, while another favored the elections of Rabbi Moses Rothenberg.
So this, of course, often happens. You have more than one rabbi, and the question is, who is going to be chosen? Now, remember, brilliant as he was, Chacham Tzvi was kind of unusual. First of all, Chacham didn't sit that well. Secondly, his methods of learning were Sephardic in that they were much more rational and less populistic than the Polish rabbis. And thirdly, his integrity was something of a problem, okay? Too keen to only do the right thing and not respecting the rich and the powerful. So the powerful supported Rabbi Rothenberg, who was no mean scholar. There were others who supported Chacham Tzvi because of his reputation as the head of the Klois. What happened eventually was decided.
Eventually it was decided that both candidates should serve alternatively, each for 6 months.
Now, do you think that would work?
No.
Have you ever known 2 rabbis to cooperate nicely and harmoniously? Of course not. In fact, one of the wits once said of the statement, Talmidei Chachamim marbin shalom ba'olam. Talmidei Chachamim increase peace in the world. That proves that the Gemara has a sense of humor. Okay. Each but friction, Jack. Line 4.
For 6 months.
6 months, but
each for 6 months, with
Yeah.
friction and strife over religious questions and ethical standards ensued, and finally became so intense that in 1709, Chacham Tzvi deemed it advisable to resign and to return to headship of the Klois.
And that's exactly what he did. Now, somebody has to give way. And the Chacham Tzvi blinked, and he said, I don't need all this. A pain. Now, Shmuley, you've read, right? And Yonat, you've read, and Yitz, you're next. And Ian, you're waiting in the wings.
Waiting in the wings.
דבר אחד לדור ואין שני דברים.
In
It's
1710,
Rashi.
just a second, 1710. Yitz, would you read, please? In
In
1710,
1710, Chacham Tzvi received an offer to become the rabbi of the Ashkenazi congregation of Amsterdam,
Oh,
plum rabbinic position at the time.
we're in Holland, okay? Goeie avond, and all that. In addition to free housing.
In addition to free housing, the office carried a yearly salary of 2,500 Dutch guilders, which was considered considerable sum of money in those days. 50 years later, 375 guilders was the usual salary of the chief rabbi of Berlin.
So it really was very tempting. Much of the negotiation
between the Chacham Tzvi and the Parnasim of the Ashkenazi community related to the independence and dignity of the rabbinate. Chacham Tzvi renounced the various financial perks which came with the position, such as fees for arbitrating civil suits and for performing weddings.
And we do remember the old Anglo-Jewish joke about V'natata hatene biyadecha, you shall give the Kohen a tenner, meaning a 10-pound note, okay? But whatever it is, this is going to be a theme for the rabbinate from the 17th century onwards. Rabbis are being forced to compromise, and those who want to be able to be authentic and not play politics are finding it more and more difficult. And that's the difference between the Rishonim up until Rabbi Yosef Karo and afterwards. The status of the rabbinate has changed. We're in the early modern period and things are changing, and the rabbinate is now becoming somewhat of a battleground. Okay, so he renounced the financial perks. And remember, we didn't want to take money for weddings or for a din Torah. And today, it's done all the time. But made it clear
that he would only accept the Amsterdam offer if the Parnasim agreed that under no circumstances was he to be required to subordinate himself to the congregation, and that he should be permitted to preserve absolute freedom of action on all occasions.
So, if you ever sat on a community of a shul, you know that this is not going to fly, because you want the rabbi under your thumb. Ian, Taylor, line 17, the deal. Ian? Ian Taylor. Hello?
Disappeared.
I was on mute because I had a double noise.
All right, line 17.
The deal was eventually sealed, and Chacham Tzvi and his family moved to Amsterdam. From the very outset, however, his rabbinate was beset by controversy. A bitter dispute broke out over rival cantors, and when he sided with one of them, the members of the opposing faction became his detractors, and one of them, a certain Aaron Polak Hokus, went so far as to name his dog Tzvi. In 1711, a debate ensued over the dismissal of the sexton.
The sexton is the shamus.
The Gabba, the shamus.
The shamus, no.
No, the shamus.
The shamus.
Once again, Chacham Tzvi found himself on the side of the disenfranchised. He wasn't a good politician, obviously.
He was a terrible politician. He wanted to be a man of principle. So how could he be a politician?
Getting it wrong. Of disenfranchised against powerful and incumbent oligarchic lay leaders.
A poor, unfortunate shamus, and one of the rich people takes a dislike to him, so he says, get rid of this guy. And Chacham Tzvi says, you can't do that. And they said, well, you might say that, but we're going to punish you. And that's what happened. The difficulties with the Parnasim
became so serious that in early 1713, it was decided to dismiss Chacham Tzvi at the end of the 3-year term mentioned in his appointment letter. Chacham Tzvi, however, had inserted a scriptural verse in the contract, the import of which was that the appointment was for a longer period, and argued that refusing to extend his employment beyond 3 years was a breach of contract.
Now, the rich and the powerful were not that convinced, why you're trying to pull a fast one over us. But what did he do? Chacham Tzvi appealed to
Portuguese communal leadership.
He learned the first rule of politics: you need allies. Okay.
He was and used his influence on his behalf, and its support helped him to.
Because he was one of them. He was a Chacham Tzvi, wasn't Rabbi Tzvi. So, and he's also had a lot of correspondence with them, and he was, in a way, their halakhic advisor. And and you know from Amsterdam, which is the biggest shul? The huge complex is the Esnocha, the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. It was basically controlled. So the Portuguese said something, the Ashkenazim would have to listen. So read the last sentence, please. He appealed to the
Portuguese common law leadership to use his influence on his behalf, and its support helped him to narrowly only escape the Ashkenazi community's first attempt to terminate his contract.
They will see that they wanted, this was only the first attempt, there was going to be a second attempt, terminating rabbis' contracts, an issue to this day, okay? All over the world, we want to get rid of the rabbi, but here's a contract then. But the last sentence, please, Ian.
His victory was short-lived.
And the continuation of the story is next week, the same time, 7:45 in Switzerland, 8:45 here. And then we will begin to discuss the some of the very powerful and today very influential ideas that Chacham Tzvi elaborates in his Tshuvot. I'm going to stop the share, and I also need to stop the recording. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to do the stop recording button.
Mhm.
Need perhaps twice. Are you sure I want to stop recording to the cloud?